There is a hallway in an abandoned psychiatric hospital where the silence feels preserved rather than empty. The corridor stretches farther than expected, lined with identical doors that once separated hundreds of patients from the outside world. Rusted bed frames remain inside certain rooms. Wheelchairs sit untouched in corners beneath peeling paint. The windows are tall but narrow, allowing light inside without offering much view beyond the ground. And beneath the building, there are tunnels, long underground corridors originally built to transport supplies, laundry, bodies, and staff movement away from public view. In some hospitals, these tunnels connected entire networks of wards and auxiliary buildings, creating a second hidden system beneath the institution itself. At first, none of this seems unusual. Large psychiatric hospitals were designed to function as self-contained environments. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, mental illness was poorly understood, treatments were limited, and institutional care became the dominant solution across Europe and North America. This was the official explanation, and in many cases, the intentions behind these institutions were not originally cruel. Early reformers believed psychiatric hospitals would provide calm environments away from overcrowded cities and dangerous conditions. Fresh air, routine, silence, and separation from ordinary stress were considered therapeutic. Many hospitals were built in rural areas intentionally, surrounded by open land meant to encourage recovery. Some institutions genuinely improved conditions compared to earlier forms of imprisonment or neglect. But over time, the systems changed. Patient populations grew faster than understanding of mental illness itself. Hospitals became overcrowded, staff shortages increased, treatments became more experimental, and gradually, the line between care and containment began to blur. Because once a person entered the institution, leaving was not always simple. Some patients remained inside for decades, not necessarily because they were dangerous, but because society outside the hospital often had nowhere else for them to go. There were people admitted for depression, trauma, addiction, epilepsy, anxiety, grief, or behaviors considered socially disruptive at the time. In some historical cases, women were institutionalized for resisting family authority, expressing emotional distress too openly, or simply failing to conform to expectations considered normal within their era. The official records often use broad language: nervous instability, melancholia, hysteria, terms vague enough to justify confinement without requiring precise understanding. And once inside the system, identity itself could begin dissolving into institutional routine. Patients wore identical clothing, followed identical schedules, occupied identical rooms. Over time, individuality became increasingly secondary to management. There were also treatments that reflected the limitations and dangers of medicine during the period: electroconvulsive therapy, insulin shock treatment, forced sedation, hydrotherapy, and eventually lobotomies were all introduced with the belief that severe mental illness required aggressive intervention. Some methods later proved beneficial when used carefully and ethically. Others became infamous for the damage they caused. The lobotomy remains one of the clearest examples. Initially promoted as a breakthrough treatment for severe psychiatric disorders, the procedure spread rapidly across hospitals. During the mid-20th century, thousands of patients underwent operations that permanently altered cognition, personality, and emotional capacity. Some became quieter afterward, more manageable, and for overcrowded institutions, manageability itself often became interpreted as improvement. This is one of the most disturbing patterns repeated throughout institutional history. Treatments sometimes evolved around operational efficiency as much as patient recovery. A calm patient reduced pressure on staff. A silent ward simplified control. Behavior became easier to organize when emotional expression itself diminished. Again, this was not always intentional cruelty. Many doctors believed sincerely they were helping, but large institutions developed momentum of their own, especially when overcrowding, limited funding, and social fear combine inside closed systems. There is also the architecture itself. Old psychiatric hospitals were often enormous. Endless corridors connected wards separated by diagnosis, gender, severity, and perceived danger. Locked doors controlled movement constantly. Observation windows allowed monitoring without interaction. The design created distance between staff and patients, between patients and society, and eventually between patients and ordinary life itself. Some hospitals became so large they functioned almost like isolated towns. They contained kitchens, laundries, farms, cemeteries, chapels, tunnels, workshops, and administrative buildings entirely within institutional grounds. A person could spend years inside these environments without meaningful contact with the outside world, and many did. There were also underground systems designed specifically to keep certain forms of movement invisible. Bodies transported after death, supplies moved between buildings, patients transferred quietly through tunnels during winter or emergencies. Officially, these tunnels were practical infrastructure, and often they were, but psychologically, they reinforced another feeling entirely, that the institution existed as a world beneath ordinary society, partially hidden, operating according to its own rules. This separation became especially dangerous when oversight weakened, because institutions isolate not only patients, but information. Abuse inside closed systems is harder to observe from the outside. Records remain internal. Testimony becomes easier to dismiss when coming from individuals already labeled mentally unstable. And historically, this happened repeatedly. Neglect, over-medication, physical restraint, unsanitary conditions. In some hospitals, investigations later revealed environments far worse than the public imagined, while the institutions remained active. Yet many continued operating for decades regardless. There is also the psychological effect of institutionalization itself. Long-term confinement changes behavior gradually. Patients adapt to routines, restrictions, and dependency until ordinary life outside the institution begins feeling unfamiliar or even frightening. Some individuals eventually lost the ability to function independently, not because of their original condition, but because the institution had replaced ordinary existence completely. The hospital became reality. Everything beyond it became abstract. This created a devastating cycle. The longer patients remained confined, the harder reintegration became, which then justified continued confinement. And perhaps that is what makes these places feel so unsettling now. Not simply the abandoned buildings, but the realization that many institutions genuinely believed they were helping while simultaneously erasing parts of the people inside them, quietly, systematically, through routine more than violence. The hallways still remain, the doors still locked from the outside. The observation rooms still overlook empty wards, and in many abandoned hospitals, patient records were discovered long after closure boxes of names, diagnoses, behavioral notes, and faded photographs documenting lives gradually absorbed into institutional systems. Some patients eventually recovered and left. Others died inside, and some simply disappeared into decades of paperwork until even their families lost contact with them entirely. This is not hidden history. The records exist. The buildings still stand in many places, but the scale of institutionalization during the 19th and 20th centuries remains difficult to fully process now because modern society no longer sees these environments daily. The hospitals were built at the edges of cities, away from ordinary visibility, and perhaps that distance mattered more than people realized. Because once suffering becomes separated physically from public life, it also becomes easier psychologically to ignore. The institutions continue operating quietly behind walls, gates, locked wards, and administrative systems that appear orderly from the outside. Everything looks controlled, professional, clinical, until enough time passes for the records to surface, showing what prolonged isolation, forced treatment, and institutional routine actually did to many of the people inside. And perhaps the most disturbing realization is not that these hospitals existed, it is that many were considered progressive when they were built, careful, modern, humane, because history rarely recognizes its own systems as dangerous while they are functioning normally. Only later, when the corridors empty and the files become public, does the silence inside those buildings begin to feel different, not peaceful, not healing, but heavy with the realization that entire lives once disappeared behind those locked doors, often quietly enough that the world outside barely noticed at all.